Welcome. Today we are looking at a case that is, at its heart, a profound personal tragedy. But it's also one of the most powerful examples you'll find of how one family's fight for answers can trigger massive and necessary changes in our justice system. We're going to be examining the death of Theresa Allore. It's a story that starts back in 1978 in Quebec, Canada. And what's so important about this case is that even though it remains officially unsolved, it became the spark that led to real, tangible reform in how cold cases are handled across the entire province. We're approaching this with a great deal of respect for Theresa and for her family, whose fight for the truth is really the engine of this entire story.
That's right. The information we have here gives us a very clear path to follow through decades of, well, injustice and struggle, but also eventual success on a policy level.
Yeah.
So our goal here is pretty straightforward. We're going to structure our analysis in three parts. First, we need to really break down the initial event and the deeply flawed official response that followed in 78 and 79.
Right.
Then we'll get into the long, independent investigation that was driven, for the most part, by Theresa's brother, John Allore. We'll look at how things like pattern recognition played a key role. And finally, we'll trace how that campaign led directly to a lasting systemic impact, the creation of specialized cold case units in Quebec.
That structure is so important because the story of Theresa Allore is really more than just a single cold case. It's a lens through which we can examine the very integrity of an investigation. Theresa was only 19 years old. She was a college student just starting her life, and her disappearance in November of 1978 set off a mission that would ultimately secure a form of justice. Maybe not for her specifically, but for so many other victims whose stories might have just been lost to time.
Exactly. And to really grasp the scale of the changes that John Allore brought about, you first have to understand the initial circumstances. We have to look at the specific structural and cultural problems that make that initial police response so catastrophic.
Okay, so let's set the scene then. Let's start with the facts of the initial event. Theresa Allore, 19 years old, is a student at Champlain College, Lennoxville. That's in the eastern townships of Quebec. And the sources are very careful to detail the geography here, which, as we'll see, becomes really critical.
The geography is a key detail. It's so often missed in early reports, but it's absolutely vital for any kind of crime analysis. So Theresa disappeared on a Friday, November 3rd, 1978. She vanished from the college campus in Lennoxville. But, and this is a crucial distinction, while the campus was in Lennoxville, her dorm, her actual residence, was in a different community called Compton.
And Compton was about a 15-minute drive south, right?
That's right, a separate location. And this is so important because any police response, or lack of response, would have been split between those two different places, likely handled by different people, which creates confusion from the very start.
The sources really communicate this feeling of absolute helplessness. The family just had to wait, and they waited for 5 months between when she vanished and when her body was discovered that next spring.
The emotional toll of those 5 months is, it's impossible to calculate. But the damage it did to the case itself, that's measurable. On April 13th, 1979, that awful wait came to an end. Her body was found by a muskrat trapper in a small body of water.
And the location of the discovery is another key point.
It is. She was found about 1 kilometer, so just over half a mile, from her dorm in Compton. This discovery should have instantly changed everything. The case goes from a missing person, which, frankly, it never really was treated as a high priority, to a full-blown suspicious death investigation.
And the condition her body was in when she was found. It's a devastating detail, but it speaks volumes about the criminal nature of what happened.
It does. The sources confirm that when her body was recovered, she was wearing only her underwear. Now, you combine that with the environmental factors, being in water for 5 months, it immediately points to a highly suspicious death, to foul play.
It seems so obvious.
It does. But this grim physical evidence stands in just staggering contrast to what the police and the college did next. And that's where the institutional failure truly begins.
Let's unpack that initial response. The sources are extremely critical of it. They describe how the Allore family's pain was just made so much worse by what they call a laissez-faire attitude.
That's the term they use, yes, laissez-faire.
Coming from both the officials at Champlain College and, crucially, from the police themselves.
And using that specific term laissez-faire, it's very deliberate. It suggests more than just a lack of urgency. It points to a kind of institutional indifference, a refusal by the authorities to even consider the most obvious, the most serious explanation that a crime had been committed.
And that indifference was shaped by the general attitudes of the time, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The sociocultural climate of 1978 plays a huge role here. In the late 70s, especially when it came to a missing female college student, there was this tendency, and not just in Quebec, this is a national issue, for authorities to immediately frame it through a lens of moral judgment.
So what was the first official theory?
When she first disappeared in November 1978, the police department's initial response was to suggest she was simply a runaway.
A runaway. That's an operational decision that has, just lethal consequences for an investigation.
It is the ultimate investigative shortcut, isn't it? As soon as you label a 19-year-old college student a runaway, the priority level just plummets.
It's no longer a potential crime.
Exactly. It shifts the entire perception away from a criminal emergency, which would demand immediate resources, witness interviews, securing potential crime scenes, and it turns it into a private, non-criminal matter.
And that means the critical first 48 hours, that golden window for collecting evidence, is just gone.
Completely lost. If you think she ran away, you don't look for signs of an abduction. You don't secure her room as a crime scene. You just wait.
So the first failure was based on a flawed assumption that completely undermined any real search. But then, when her body was found in April, the official story changed again, but it still managed to avoid the conclusion of murder.
Precisely. The body is tragically discovered, and let's remember, found only in her underwear, a kilometer from her home. And the second official hypothesis the police offered was that she was possibly the victim of a drug overdose.
An overdose?
Yes, and perhaps, they suggested, with the assistance of some of her college friends.
That narrative seems just as damaging as the first one, especially given the circumstances. To suggest that a body found like that after 5 months was just an assisted overdose, it points to an incredible level of institutional tunnel vision, doesn't it?
It shows an almost deliberate attempt to minimize the most suspicious elements of the case. The initial assumptions, first runaway, then overdose, they both did two things. First, as the sources clearly document, they compounded the family's pain.
Of course.
But from a justice standpoint, the critical damage is this. Both theories focus the blame inward. Either it's on Theresa for running away, or it's on her friends for drug use. This actively prevents investigators from looking for external evidence.
Things like fibers, tire tracks.
Exactly. Shoe prints, vehicle tracks at the scene, all the things that are vital to linking a predator to a crime. If you're investigating overdose, you're looking at toxicology reports, not a suspect's geographic movements. The two paths lead in completely different directions.
So the police were essentially investigating a crime that their own narrative had already decided wasn't a crime at all.
Yes, and that failure to properly secure the scene, to launch an aggressive search based on the physical evidence, it meant that any trace evidence, the kind of evidence that today could lead to a breakthrough with DNA, was either lost to the elements, contaminated, or just never collected in the first place.
So those flawed assumptions weren't just insensitive, they were an operational catastrophe.
They were. A catastrophe that would take decades of work just to begin to undo.
Which means that if the official response was defined by negligence and bad assumptions, the only way forward was for the family to essentially take control of the investigation themselves.
The need for their advocacy was born directly out of that investigative vacuum. They had to spend the next 20 years just convincing the world that this was, in fact, a crime that deserved a real investigation.
And that takes us into the second phase of this story, which really kicks off more than 2 decades later in the early 2000s. This is where we start to see the power of external pressure. So how did this case, which had been cold for so long, get forced back into the public consciousness?
The revitalization really began in the summer of 2002. The Allore family, knowing that the official channels had completely failed them, reached out to an investigative reporter named Patricia Pearson. She was also a personal friend.
And she took on the case.
She did. She produced a really powerful series of articles for Canada's National Post. And her work wasn't just, a sad look back at a tragedy. It was a carefully built argument. She presented evidence that Theresa Allore was murdered, and this is the significant part, that her death was very likely linked to other unsolved local cases.
That's a huge moment. The shift from seeing Theresa Allore as one isolated tragedy to seeing her as part of a potential pattern.
It's massive, because it provides a strategic framework that the police should have been using back in 1979, but now it had to be built from the outside by a journalist.
And this public pressure from the media then gave momentum to Theresa's brother, John Allore, to really ramp up his own investigation.
It did. John Allore had never stopped, but now he intensified his efforts. He kept collecting information, he cross-referenced old files, and he started to engage with the public in a new way. This led him to create the true crime podcast, Who Killed Theresa?
Starting a podcast devoted to a family member's cold case, that is an incredible act of dedication. The sources note that it started as a very personal exploration of his sister's death, but it didn't stay that way for long.
No, it expanded very quickly. That expansion is the exact moment where personal grief transforms into public activism. Allure realized that the failures in his sister's case were not unique. They were, in fact, symptomatic of a much larger pattern of unsolved violence in that region of Quebec.
So the podcast became a platform to talk about other cases as well.
Exactly. And that broader focus, which combined his own rigorous investigation with public visibility, along with his continued work with Patricia Pearson, all culminated in their book, Wish You Were Here, which was published in 2020. They essentially created a public parallel archive for the case, and the cases connected to it.
So let's turn to the investigative breakthrough. This is what moved the work beyond speculation and into the realm of, well, validated criminal science. John Allore didn't just have a hunch there was a link. He found specific resemblances. What were those links?
His work digging through local files, it uncovered some really unsettling similarities. He found close resemblances between what happened to Theresa and the recent deaths of two other young women, Manon Dubé and Louise Cameron.
And what were the similarities?
The details that connect them are striking. You have young women, their bodies found in different locations, but within the same general regional corridor. They all show similar characteristics of foul play, and it's all happening within a very tight historical window. This led Allure to theorize that these three deaths were committed by the same person. He was suggesting a serial predator was operating, essentially unchecked.
A serial predator theory. That's a direct challenge to decades of official thinking that these were all separate, isolated cases. But for that theory to get any traction with the police, it would need some serious validation.
It would, and it got it from the highest level of investigative expertise. The theory gained powerful academic support from a very respected source, Dr. Kim Rossmo.
Kim Rossmo, he's a huge name in this field.
A huge name. At the time, he was a renowned geographic profiler and a consultant for the FBI. He's known internationally for his pioneering work in the spatial analysis of serial crimes.
So for those of us listening, can you break down what geographic profiling actually is? It sounds technical, but why was Rossmo's mathematical approach so important here?
Geographic profiling is a fascinating tool. It works on the premise that serial criminals, no matter how random their victims might seem, tend to operate within a specific geographic comfort zone.
So they stick to areas they know.
In a way, yes. Rossmo's analysis uses these very sophisticated algorithms, they're called distance decay functions, to map the locations of linked crimes. He'll map the body disposal sites, the attack sites, the victim's last known location. By analyzing the distances between all those points, his model can statistically predict a high probability search area. And that area usually contains the offender's anchor point. It could be their home, their workplace, somewhere of great significance to them.
So it's basically using math to prove that these crimes are not random events scattered across a map, but are actually clustered around a single hidden point of origin. What did Rossmo's analysis tell the police about these cases in Quebec?
His analysis strongly supported the serial predator hypothesis. He advised the police to officially start investigating these deaths as a linked series.
He gave them a specific time frame, didn't he?
He did. He suggested that a single predator was likely operating in that Quebec region from the early 1970s through 1981. The sources are very specific about that window, 1971 to 1981.
Wow.
This provided a crucial data-driven framework for the investigation. It shifted the perspective from individual, isolated cold cases into a single, cohesive project file that spanned an entire decade.
That 10-year time frame, 71 to 81, that's the window identified by a professional profiler. That must have expanded the scope of potential victims far beyond just Theresa, Manon Dubé, and Louise Cameron.
It did. John Allore's own comprehensive research went on to identify dozens of other unsolved murders and disappearances from that same period that could potentially fit this emerging pattern.
Which really highlights the power of this kind of pattern recognition.
It's transformative. When the early local police work fails to connect the dots, often because of that laissez-faire attitude we talked about, which minimized the crimes from the start, it takes an external advocate armed with these specialized forensic techniques to basically reconstruct a history of violence and show a much larger, much darker picture.
It's essentially a retroactive proof of the initial systemic failure. Because if the police in 78 and 79 were operating under the false assumption that Theresa's death was a runaway or an overdose, they were probably applying that same flawed logic to the deaths of Dubé, Cameron, and who knows how many others.
That is the core systemic failure they uncovered. If local police forces treat a suspicious death as an isolated incident, or worse, write it off as non-criminal, they never do the kind of multi-jurisdictional analysis needed to link it to other events.
And the serial offender remains invisible.
Completely invisible, because the cases never merge into a single timeline. Rosmo's work with geographic profiling fundamentally forced law enforcement to confront the possibility that these were not random acts of violence, but the sustained work of a single person operating with impunity for years.
It makes it so clear why the independent investigation was so vital. It provided the intellectual work and the relentless external pressure needed to force that conceptual shift from isolated tragedies to a sustained pattern of serial violence.
Without that pressure, those dozens of other cases would likely still be sitting in dusty file cabinets today, scattered across different police jurisdictions, never benefiting from the kind of holistic analysis needed for a breakthrough.
And once that pattern was scientifically validated, the focus had to change entirely. The problem was clearly much bigger than just one cold case. Which brings us to the lasting legacy.
Right. John Allore's work then transitions again. He goes from investigating his sister's death to actively lobbying for permanent structural change within the Quebec justice system itself. The ability of one person, motivated by such a profound loss, to become a highly effective policy advocate. It's really the blueprint this story leaves behind.
This final phase of the story really starts to take shape around 2018, which is almost 40 years after Theresa's death. John Allore broadens his focus, looking beyond his sister's case to examine the investigative standards and failures across other Quebec cold cases from the 70s right up to the modern day. What was his central argument against the system at that point?
His core argument, which is cited again and again in the sources, was all about systemic failures in Quebec's criminal justice practices. By this point, his advocacy had evolved. He was no longer just a frustrated family member. He was a very knowledgeable critic of police procedure. The sources are very direct about this. They say Allore had reached such a point of disillusionment over the lack of progress in his sister's case that he stated he no longer trusted investigators.
That's a staggering thing for an advocate to conclude. The realization that the biggest barrier to justice isn't a lack of evidence, but a fundamental lack of institutional capability or integrity.
It is. It elevates his entire fight. It's no longer just about finding a killer. It's about demanding accountability and structural soundness for the whole system to ensure a basic level of investigative competency.
And this relentless lobbying, which was fueled by decades of frustration, it actually produced real measurable successes. The first big one came relatively early in his advocacy campaign, in the 2000s.
That's right. The first major success was in 2004.
Tell us about that.
In 2004, John Allore successfully lobbied for the creation of a Sûreté du Québec. That's the provincial police force, often called the SQ. He lobbied for them to create a dedicated cold case unit.
That is a monumental achievement.
It's huge for two reasons. Before this, older unsolved cases delanguished. They were often managed by regional detectives who were also juggling active, current cases and fighting for resources.
So creating the SQ unit in 2004 fundamentally changes the game. It carves out dedicated resources just for historical files. It's the government acknowledging a responsibility for the investigative failures of the past.
Precisely. And a provincial unit like the SQ's Cold Case Squad has a much wider mandate than a local police force. It can look at crimes across multiple towns and regions, which is essential for identifying the kind of serial patterns that Rosmo pointed out.
And they can focus on new technology.
Exactly. Its dedicated function allows it to focus on leveraging new forensic technologies, things like mitochondrial DNA analysis, advanced fiber tracking, things that were science fiction back in 1978. It set a crucial precedent.
So the 2004 unit set the framework at the provincial level. But his work didn't stop there. He kept pushing for reform in other major jurisdictions. What was the next big institutional victory?
The second major victory came much later, in 2019. On January 17th of that year, the Montreal Police, the Service de Police de la Ville de Montréal, or SPVM, they announced the creation of their own dedicated cold case squad.
And the sources are clear that this was largely due to his efforts.
They explicitly state it was in large part due to the lobbying efforts of John Allore.
That 15-year gap between the SQ unit in 2004 and the SPVM unit in 2019 is interesting. Why is a dedicated municipal unit in a city like Montreal so important, and why do you think it took another decade and a half to happen?
Well, the impact of the SPVM unit is profound because Montreal is a major city. It holds a huge volume of historical unsolved cases, often in complex urban settings. The SQ handles provincial matters, but the SPVM is the heart of the region's largest city. As for the time lag, it's instructive. It suggests that while Allure created momentum in 2004, it took years and years of continuous pressure to force a major municipal government like Montreal's to prioritize historical cases over the more immediate, visible demands of daily policing.
And the timing of that 2019 unit is also critical from an investigative standpoint. How does a cold case unit created in 2019 give a victim from 1978 a better shot at justice than the one created in 2004?
The difference is technology. It's a massive leap. The 2004 unit could use earlier forms of DNA technology, which was great, but the 2019 unit was created at the absolute height of genetic genealogy and advanced forensic sequencing.
Right.
These modern techniques allow investigators to take tiny, degraded, or contaminated samples, the exact kind of samples that were probably salvaged from the flawed 1979 investigation, and use them to find distant familial matches in public databases. They can generate leads that were simply impossible even in 2004, let alone 1978. The 2019 unit has a completely different arsenal.
So John Allore started by just trying to prove his sister was murdered, challenging these dismissive narratives of her being a runaway or dying from an overdose. And he ended up fundamentally reshaping the modern systems by which historical crimes are investigated.
He did. He ensured that the critical technological advances of the 21st century could be retroactively applied to the failures of the 20th.
Yeah.
And this incredible level of dedication and his success in influencing policy, it didn't go unnoticed by the government itself.
Tell us about the formal recognition he received.
In November of 2018, just a few months before the Montreal police announced their cold case unit, John Allore was formally recognized for his decades of work. He was awarded the Senate of Canada's Sesquicentennial Medal.
And what was the citation for?
The specific recognition was for your valuable service to the nation.
Valuable service to the nation. That phrasing really captures the scale of his achievement, doesn't it? It acknowledges that his mission went far beyond personal grief. It became a public service aimed at fixing institutional problems to ensure future families in that situation would have a professional, dedicated response available to them from the start.
It's the perfect reflection point. A single family's refusal to accept injustice had a profound, lasting, and demonstrably positive impact on the entire criminal justice infrastructure of a region. It's the very definition of turning personal tragedy into systemic public good.
So, to just structure the importance of this journey for everyone listening, we moved from this tragic case that was buried under institutional indifference and these deeply flawed assumptions, the runaway, the overdose, to a powerful, sustained effort of citizen journalism and family advocacy. And that led directly, verifiably, to institutional reform.
The creation of the Sûreté du Québec Cold Case Unit in 2004, and then the Service de Police de la Ville de Montréal Cold Case Squad in 2019. The narrative of Theresa Allore's death becomes less about solving a single crime and more about the decades-long battle for institutional accountability.
And about the recognition that every victim deserves dedicated investigative resources, no matter how much time has passed.
The core significance here, as we've laid out, is how that initial failure, the laissez-faire attitude, the false hypotheses, how that necessitated this decades-long public fight just to force modernization.
And what should be really relevant to you as you listen is the power of that pattern recognition, especially when it was aided by experts like Kim Rossmo. By connecting Theresa Allore to Manon Dubé and Louise Cameron, and then identifying that broader 10-year window of serial violence, Allore and Pearson basically exposed a long period of systemic vulnerability in that part of Quebec.
This whole story, which is so well documented in the book, Wish You Were Here, it really forces you to look past the mistakes of individual officers and examine the investigative systems themselves. The literature that's referenced in the sources, including Rossmo's own work, it often gets into the specific nature of what are called criminal investigative failures.
It's in the analysis of those initial failures that we find our final thought. This case shows so starkly that the initial blind spots, that immediate tendency to assume runaway or non-criminal accident or overdose, those are the most catastrophic mistakes for the long-term solvability of a case. They prevent the first crucial step of connecting the dots.
So we want to leave you with this question to think about. If specialized, dedicated cold case units, like the ones in Quebec, only exist today because a single family refused to stop investigating for over 40 years, what does that necessity tell us about the persistence of those initial biases?
Where does the idea of a runaway or an overdose in suspicious circumstances still affect investigative processes today? Perhaps ensuring that other patterns of violence remain hidden and continue to go unsolved. This battle for institutional integrity, the one sparked by the death of Theresa Allore, may still be far from won.
A truly profound line of inquiry for you to consider.
Thanks for listening.